We officially on the rocking. Okay, good morning. This is another episode of Afro Lit 101. Today we are going to just finish off what we've been doing in terms of the three steps of this. I mean, the five steps of the steps to start a renaissance, but we've broken it down into three sections, and those sections are primarily the obstacle, the miracle, and now we're getting into the oracle side, which is like being able to use the past to be able to project into the future. And that's kind of like the key to what we've been going about in terms of the steps to start a renaissance the whole way, because we're trying to tap into the 20th century, renaissance movements between South Africa and America, African Americans specifically, and how they kind of relate and how they've, fed each other over the time. So we got a couple more paragraphs that we're going to go through, and then I want to actually like dive into a teaser of what we're going to be going into next week, which is going to be another class. It's going to be a different situation next week because I have a festival that I'm going to, so I may not be on live as much as I'm usually am. Oh, shout out to my brother in the chat. I see my brother Put is in there. Shout out to you, my G. Much love to you and everything you got going on. You know what I'm saying? I called you on accident. That was I guess you call it a butt dial or whatever you want to call it. You know what I'm saying? But I still, would love to connect whenever we can. Uh, but yeah, so we're just gonna go live today. This is just a quick little conversation to start our morning. It's 6:30 here in South Africa. I know it's a late in the evening in America, but we also just want to just have both sides being able to tap in. So, like I said, we are doing basically like a Afro Lit 101 where we reverse engineer African literature. And today we're going to tap into some of the aspects of the South African literature that was able to connect with, influence those in America and kind of put things in South Africa in a different perspective. So, the full recaps of these videos can be found on YouTube. And yeah, we're going to continue to do this for the next couple of weeks. I have a couple more articles, and any articles that we do put forth, you can find on Substack. Let me just drop that in the comments so that you guys can tap in and read along. But we have gone over majority of the article so far because it's Friday. We do this Mondays and Wednesdays, and then now we're going to go into the last piece of the article. So I'm just going to dive right in where we left off was basically, the last paragraph was mentioning the fact that after they had some level of exile of South African writers from America, I mean, sorry, from South Africa, they kind of was in exile during the apartheid era. And from there, they was, relocated in America. And in that aspect, they was basically like being able to institutionalize a lot of stuff that was being suppressed in Africa. And these were like at the universities of UCLA, where they had the professor Mazisi Kunene, and he was basically like preserving some level of African intellectualism that was helping people of America basically like reconnect with their identity as Africans. And it was very powerful in the midst of being able to have an avenue and an institution to be able to put these things forward while a lot of the suppression was happening back home in South Africa. So one of the significant figures such as Emperor Shaka Zulu were able to be recognized for their strategic political minds when their stories were captured by compatriots rather than foreigners who often seemed intent on undermining the cultural context involved. So when you look at somebody like Shaka Zulu, you may think of it as more of a, I don't know, from the viewpoint of the people that were fighting against Shaka Zulu versus like the people that was on the side of Shaka Zulu, look at him as more of an emperor and somebody that was, helping basically like fight back versus somebody that may be looking at it as something that they needed to colonize. And that's kind of like what the history is depicted as from the winner's viewpoint or from the viewpoint of the European side, which is majority of the text. But when you have somebody like Mazisi Kunene who's able to write about it, he's, capturing him as an emperor versus just as a savage or some level of just a wild man that is just he was actually like an emperor and he had like an army and he was really having a force to be able to fight against what was happening in terms of the British and Afrikaans colonization in South Africa. So this is just kind of going to that aspect. And then details of this and similar studies were further deliberated in collegiate settings through longstanding lineages of professors teaching African linguistics and literature at UCLA. So UCLA in California actually has a Black alumni class, and they had like a legacy of like 40 years of teaching African linguistics and African literature. And Mazisi Kunene was a big part of that practice, where he taught there for 20 years before returning back to South Africa when apartheid was upended. So the Black alumni who were instrumental in adopting this influence for the purpose of formulating a deeper understanding of their own identities while combating the institutionalized subjugation placed upon third world countries, now hosted the spirit of nonconformity that originated in their own ancestors' backyard. So as they are, speaking about basically like the pre-colonial aspect of African identity, because the real purpose that Mazisi Kunene was going, to Africa, outside of Africa to kind of share what was going on was that his literature didn't want to be, based in basically a response to what was going on in terms of apartheid and wanted to not be as reactionary and wanted to be more forward of the continuing the pre-colonial aspect of South African literature. So in that aspect, he was able to pass that across to the Black alumni of African American cultures at UCLA. So the Black alumni is basically like it's an organization that has emerged from the alumni class of the university, and they basically now have an identity of their African. They understand a little bit better of their African identity, which is more of a non-conformity that originated in their own ancestors' backyard, and they now doesn't look appropriate, or I guess associate Africa as something that is subjugated as a third world country. They are now enlightened to more of the aspects that will help them basically understand fully who they are and what they have going on. And a combined force surfaced once the staff writers in Black Mamba Rising literary schools of South Africa coincided with the newly embraced African American period of remembrance. So as this was going on in America, the resurgence of some level of South African identity, it also was movements in South Africa in terms of the Black Mamba Rising literary schools and the staff writers who were also, coinciding with a level of synchronicity with the African American period of remembrance due by the likes of the exiled professors that was able to put some level of information. And it was other aspects too, like hip hop was a big thing. They had a big identity situation with hip hop where they was more so identifying with their African roots with, the native tongues and the Tribe Called Quest and the African Mbadas of the world, the Zulu Nation, the the hip hop Zulu Nation, not the real Zulu Nation. But all in all, they was able to basically like tie in continuance of this renaissance that was rooted in what was happening before, when it was the Harlem Renaissance, and that led to the Sophiatown Renaissance, where they had the drum writers and the District 6 writers, and then from there it kind of emerged into a suppression and then the exile, and then now it's reemerging again in the later 20th century. So going forward, awareness of the shared struggle crescendoed in the late 1980s, leading up to an end of South Africa's apartheid, which eventually allowed for the return of persistent teachers from their unsolicited exodus. So as we were talking about, Mazisi Kunene was able to come back after the apartheid era, and then from there, you know, it allowed for them to basically like return from their exodus to these areas of exile. And in that, um, the awareness of the shared struggle like crescendoed from African Americans now being I guess understanding a little bit more of what was happening in South Africa, because the exiled writers was able to lift up and get some alliances from those in America. And from that aspect, there was a return after the exodus from the South African writers of Mazisi Kunene, Ntongela, Masilela. They was able to return back to South Africa and basically institutionalize themselves, because Mazisi Kunene, he has a foundation that's in Durban now that I've been able to work with. And he also has just um, a lot of stuff that holds and preserves what he was doing in terms of, preserving that pre-colonial expression of South African writings. He has like 100, I think 10,000 Zulu manuscripts that he has still in effect. And in that aspect, it's just something that is still very valuable in terms of not only having literary works that are in response to the apartheid nature, which happening, during the Sophiatown Renaissance and the Drum Writers magazine and the what is it? They have the Black Mamba Rising and these different writing movements that was happening in South Africa. This is more of a work that was more based in the Zulu language and kind of trying to have a more pure expression. If you read a lot of his works, it doesn't really like even fit in the realm of today. It's like it's either talking about Emperor Shaka the Zulu or these anthem of the decades, these things that are happening without any context of even like the experience of the modern day. So this is something where you could tap into that type of information. So consolidating the commonalities between these symbiotic movements into an open source library has become a necessary impulse for those who have survived the journey into the third millennium. The freedoms earned through their determination, combined with advances in digital infrastructure, have amplified access and compounded the value available to future generations. So now that we have basically like this movement back towards, South Africa after the apartheid era, they have now different tools involved to where the foundation that you have in terms of the Mazisi Kunene Library and museum, it kind of is showing a level of impulse that people may have to basically like preserve this stuff even further for the next generation to be able to tap into it and understand that if you are having some level of creative renaissance today in South Africa, that you don't have to start from scratch. Like you can tap into a base that will give you knowledge of, what people was facing before and how they express themselves and how that can kind of continue on with what you're doing. So you're not um, just starting from zero. And the freedoms earned through their determination, combined with advances in digital infrastructure, have amplified access and compounded the value available to future generations. So now future generations can access it through digital works. And there's different avenues besides just having to have the physical presence, because a lot of this stuff can be found online. You can order stuff online. You can order copies of the book online, and then there's also a preservation as this stuff is being digitized in the process. Accepting the proverbial torch of a quarter of the way into the 21st century requires acknowledging these grand efforts that were made at analog pace and expediting their deserved recognition through technological tools unavailable at the time. Supportive courses of action are absolutely mandatory if we hope to initiate the much needed renaissances of the modern day. So this is basically like how we ended this paragraph in this situation, in terms of the Mazisi Kunene Museum being a literary, house for, being able to further this movement. And the Renaissances of today need able to also look at this as a place of resource, but also support it in terms of giving some level of recognition and also giving effort to basically expedite the process of building this into more of a technological space so it can keep up with the times of today and adopting these ancient measures into something that is more modern. And this is the oracle, the last aspect, which we're going to go into later on today. But this is just the basis of what we wanted to kind of share in terms of this article, The Steps to Start a Renaissance. We'll go into later detail of just finishing this up. But as we are progressing today, I have been like just thinking about a lot of other things in terms of tapping into the past. Like I recently made a post about astrology, and not the zodiac Western astrology, but more of a galactic astrology that kind of moves at a different pace. So I want to share something with you guys that I was able to find in terms of my own ancestry, in terms of my upbringing in New Orleans, in Dolobini, I'm sorry, in Pume Peshe in Dolobini, in New Orleans. And this is something that, now that I've been living in South Africa, I've been, just doing some research on just how you can better tap in with your ancestry and just from the customs that I've been seeing people practice here. And that is something that has given me some enlightenment to be able to tap into some of my own past. And in that aspect, I've been able to just discover some certain things. And I want to kind of share with you guys a little bit of what I've been able to discover. And the main things is basically this idea of, economic empowerment that is happening in America. If some people may feel like it's a new thing or that it hasn't happened before, but actually in like the post transatlantic slave trade, they had some levels of errors once this awakening was happening in terms of consciousness of people like really in the south specifically like owning land and doing things to make sure that they can pass down to their generations, but they still had an oppressive force against them in terms of different avenues that would not allow for continuance of the wealth to kind of amass. And that is something that even in my own history, as I able to identify some of my ancestors, I can see that they were landowners, like, and that they had some level of wealth, but in terms of just certain situations, they wasn't able to just pass it down for generations to come because of the circumstances of the Jim Crow era and different, governmental forces that kind of stopped what was going on. So what I kind of want to just show right now, you can kind of look at this article that I have here. I'm gonna put it in the chat on TikTok, but if you're on YouTube, you can kind of see what I have presented, and then it will be recapped on you on later on. But this is basically an article that is speaking about St. Rose Native secures historical marker for family land. And this is something that is directly tied to my lineage. As I've told you, I've been doing more acknowledgement of my ancestors and more so recognizing a pattern that is bigger than the situation of maybe just my past in terms of Africa, but still looking at my past in terms of America, because our people have been on that land for a significant amount of time, and in that time, some things have amassed. And in terms of a lot of African Americans, we aren't able to tap into identity that is, beyond the transatlantic slave trade. So we kind of have to start acknowledging ancestors in the immediate, and in that process, you can kind of start to see that they have some efforts in terms of your ancestors on the American land that also were doing some things significantly in the Black communities. So in this aspect, we have St. Rose, Native Secures, historical marker for the family land. St. Rose is a city that's in Louisiana. I'm originally from New Orleans, but St. Rose is also, in that area. And this picture right here is one of, I guess, a great granddaughter of Oscar Dupree Sr., who is my, I guess, well, it's my grandmother's um I don't know how many lineages it is. I can't even say how many greats, but basically, this is one of my ancestors. You can see this photo here. This is Oscar Dupree and Effie Dupree, and these people basically were in Louisiana in the era of the 1850s and going into the late 19th century, I think it's called. And in that aspect, they was able to basically like run a pecan grove dairy farm after, coming from some level of being born in slavery. Like Oscar Dupree was born in slavery right before the Emancipation Proclamation, and from that he was able to amass some level of ownership, and from there being able to really grow his level of wealth from that beginning point into what what's happening today. But in the midst of that, there was some level of suppression of that, and it's kind of going into that eminent domain, which happens when the government can kind of seize your land. So in the midst of my family being able to, like, as my ancestors, I was able to do some research on this, and I was able to just tap in to see how wealth was being emerged from a black person in the in the early 1900s, middle 1800s. But after they was able to get some level of wealth, the land that they was able to acquire actually got seized by the government because of eminent domain laws. And it's something that was happening against black property in the South a lot. Like as black people were trying to amass some level of wealth, they were seasoned, like they were saying that this land needs to be used for public use rather than being able to be kept in the hands of those that owned it. And in that aspect, they, even today, you can see that this claim that is for public use has actually been a false claim, because right now the area that was primarily owned by my ancestors is now being used as a private hospital. It's an Ochsner Hospital that's in Louisiana in the Uptown area, and it was originally, an area that was owned by more of a black predominant, people, but then it kind of got seized by the government for public use, is what they call it, and they call it eminent domain laws. And I know that is something that is also prevalent in South Africa in terms of like there's a dispute about land and all of this type of situation. So this is something that also was a suppression for Black Americans in terms of being able to pass down wealth, which kind of sets us back, in the future. To my generation, we can't even, explore the wealth that was happening in terms of what was going on. But this article, I shared the article link in the chat for you guys in TikTok. But yeah, this is something that I was able to discover just in terms of my practices of understanding a little bit more of my ancestry. I've been living in South Africa for 4 years, and in that aspect, I've been learning more about the customs of ancestral acknowledgement versus, just what may be the popular thing to do in America as a Black person. And in that aspect, I've been able to just tap into a little bit of recognizing their history, because we can't really tap in too far into our history because of the transatlantic slave trade, but we can recognize those immediate ancestors. And in that aspect, I was able to just discover a lot. And I'm gonna read this article just so you guys can kind of see the history that was going on. So, what we have here, Oscar was born into, this is Oscar Dupree Sr., which is my great, 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 great grandfather. It's in the 1850s. So Oscar was born into slavery 6 months before the Emancipation Proclamation of 1863. By the 1890s, Oscar and his family established Dupree Pecan Grove Dairy, a milking, bottling, and delivery company that operated for 75 years. The family, however, faced multiple setbacks, including being forced from their first location on State Street in New Orleans, eminent domain laws, which allowed the government to take private property for public use, forced the family to move from its location on Jefferson Highway, where Ochsner Hospital now sits. If there was a location that said no, the average one of us today would say it wasn't meant to be, and we would shut it down. But Oscar just moved to the next location. I think that was very inspiring, especially for that time. They knew who they were, and they didn't back down from the eminent domain and all of the other obstacles that stood in their way. So in the midst of, this era when it's like right after Jim Crow era and it's like right after Emancipation Proclamation. My great 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 grandfather, I don't know how many greats, Nkulu Nkulu, that is one of my, serious ancestors that was able to establish some level of wealth. And in the aspect of that, even when they were shut down in terms of, the eminent domain laws taking their land, they just moved it to another area. And this is something that, just shows the persistence and the resilience of Black people to continue to try to build this wealth in the mass of what was going on. And it's something that speaks to just our, persistence as a people, even, from the times of Africa to the times of today. Is still something that is carried within us, even though we may be separated from our homeland. Like, we still have that same fight that you may find in South Africa, where I see that, people are still, having some level of fight. And we talking about right now the steps to start a renaissance. And this is something that, you have to tap back into this energy. And I think a lot of things today need that same type of energy again. And that was happening in more of the times when the pressure was a lot more higher. Because I see a lot of the response today is like, I don't know, it's not as potent as it was back then. But when you find out about this history of yourself, you kind of want to start, reading more about these eminent domain laws, seeing what, is the thing that is stopping you from being able to amass the wealth that your ancestors had. So this is something that I found very significant in terms of my history, and I've been really just going into more of an astrology approach to this, to seeing that there's a cycle, like a planetary cycle, that is, beyond basically, our lifespan. Some things are cycles that planets move in like hundreds of years.